Hello, everyone. For those of you that are just starting to join, we're going to give another minute or so for others to join before we start today's presentation. Thank you. Okay, I think we could go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, What's New in TopBraid EDG 7.1. Today, we're going to review some of the new features and integrations that are offered in the latest edition, but let me start by introducing you to our speakers today. We have Irene Polikoff, Holger Newblock, and Jesse Lambert, all with Top Quadrant. They will be highlighting the new features, and we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end as well. Before we get started, let's review a few logistical items. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along by using your GoToWebinar controls. To post questions, please look on the right-hand side control panel. If you click on the box, you should be able to post your question at any time during the presentation. We will address as many of those questions as time allows after the slides. We will also be recording today's webinar, and we'll send a link to that recorded version as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Irene to get us started.
Thank you, Christy. And let me give you a quick overview of the new features that we'll be covering today in today's webinar. We have a new visualization panel called EDG Diagram, and we will demo that and provide you with more details about this. There's also a number of new customization capabilities for how TopBraid EDG user interface presents itself. We also added some user interface improvements specific to ontologies and taxonomies, and also some general user interface improvements applicable across. We'll talk about those. There has been some changes to the built-in ontologies that TopBraid EDG ships with, so we'll cover that. 7.1 includes a number of new integrations. So there is a brand new connector to Microsoft Sharepoint term store, and there's also integration with Git that is brand new. Now with this release, we have a new tool called TopBraid EDG Studio that users of EDG can use to add features to EDG, do configurations and customizations. So in that sense, it's replacement of TopBraid Composer for the users of TopBraid EDG. And in order to make it a powerful tool, we've added a lot of different capabilities to TopBraid EDG itself. So you'll see them as part of Studio, and you'll also see some of those features as part of TopBraid EDG server. There also have been certain performance improvements, and we will cover them. One of them, which is the query booster. Now, this release these are not an exhaustive list of new features and changes in 7.1. As always, for a complete list of changes, please go to the release notes that are linked here. And in terms of who's going to be doing what, I will walk you through the first 4 bullets, then switch to Jesse to talk about SharePoint integration, and then Holger will cover the remaining 3 bullets. And then we come back for the Q&A. So with that, let's get started, and we'll do some slides, we'll do some demos, and we'll switch back and forth in terms of how we present things. So I'm going to start with this new diagram panel. So with that, let me switch to the presentation, to the demo mode, and I already have TopBraid EDG running as you see here, and specifically the asset collection that I am using here is technical asset collection example that has different applications that we are using in TopBraid EDG applications and systems such as QuickBooks, our build system, etc. So that's an asset collection I'm using for this demo example. And I already brought in this diagram panel. It is available under the panel list in this Explore section. But I've already brought it into the display. And this is a graph visualization that lets me drag and drop any type of assets or resources into the panel, and then I could explore to see additional connections. You see the arrows that allow me to explore, and I could select what connections to explore, for example, here, and you'll get this shown in a diagram. And I could also just decide to show all links. So I have a right-click menu here for expand node, and I show the neighborhood, and that's gonna show me all the possible connections from this accounting resource. So I could continue to walk the diagram like that. And in terms of being able to select only certain relationships, I could do it for a particular node, as I did with QuickBooks Online, or there is also a diagram setting panel that gives me a number of configuration preferences. For example, I could say which relationships to include and which relationships to exclude. And then that would work for the entire diagram, not just for the selected node. I could also make other settings, for example, to show queue names instead of labels. And as you can see, that kind of switches back and forth. There are some redo and undo capabilities here, and a number of other buttons that are available. So this diagram shows not just individual resources, but also classes. As you could see, for example, business activity is a class, and that shows class information as well as individual resources. So that becomes quite a busy diagram, and I could expand it. I could zoom in to get something in focus. I could change the sizing of it. I could move it around, and I could adjust various lines in the diagram, and adjust boxes, expand it, collapse it, etc. The lines themselves, I could also change how they present, for example, in terms of their color. So I could do, let's say, red, and I could make it pretty thick. So there's lots of adjustments that are available here. I could then also see a view that is panned. If this gets to be very significantly expanded. That pan view allows me to navigate within this larger diagram. How exactly resources are presented here in terms of individual classes or individual resources such as business operation, etc. For classes, we typically see properties that are applicable, and for individual resources such as business operations, by default, you're just going to see a type and a label, but that is also all configurable, and I'll touch on it a little bit as I talk about different configurations for the user interface. This is done using so-called resource summary option that lets you configure what will be shown as a summary in this box. One important part of this feature is that you could actually save the diagram. So let's say you expanded it as much as you wanted it to, and you got it to the point where it looks like what you want to share with colleagues. You could click on the save button, you could give it a name, and you could save it. And you could save it as a private view or a public view. So I'm not going to save this. I actually already have something saved. And you could bring back your saved view as I had previous. And so that in this way, diagrams become first-class citizens, and you could share them with colleagues, and you could get their input on your model, on your data. So very useful capability. Now you could remove individual nodes from view. You could also clear the whole thing by clicking on a delete. You could export. There's a number of export options, lots of different options available to you here, and you could drag and drop anything you want on this diagram and get it connected, etc. So that's a new diagram feature, and because it's a pretty extensive capability with lots of options, we have developed documentation specific for it, and as you could see, it is linked here, and you could read up on it and play with it. So we are very excited about this new feature. So let me now talk about this new user interface customization capabilities. So specifically, you could now define custom icons for different assets and types of assets. And this is done using this dash icon role property in ontologies that you develop. There's also now ability to horizontally lay out multiple values. So if you have a property that has multiple values, prior to 7.1, each value would show on its own line, and now you're able to lay them out horizontally better using the real estate, and that's done using this dash inline viewer field. The next feature, ability to add tables to forms, it's not really new in 7.1. It's actually was available pre 7.1, but I wanted to highlight it because I don't know if everyone recognizes that there is this capability. And then dash constructors allow you to define custom actions for the new buttons, also an important feature. How to use all of these features is discussed more in the documentation pages that you see linked here, and I will also point out certain aspects of it in the slides that follow. And by the way, the property roles documentation will also explain to you how to create resource summaries that will be used by the diagram to determine what to show in a box for for a given node on a diagram. Let's say you don't want to just show a type, you also want to show a description or whatever else is appropriate for that type of resource, that type of asset. So here's an example of how custom icons work. As you see, they will show in hierarchical tree displays. They will also show on a form where in the upper left corner an icon for an asset is shown. And the icons can be specified individually for different assets. So here you see Canada, Mexico, and United States have different icons. Or they could be specified for a type or a class. So let's say, you know, all the islands would have this type of icon, as we see here for West Indies. So that's a very useful feature. We think that allows you to bring in custom types of assets with their custom icons. Now, as far as the horizontal display, here's an example of it. You could see there's lots of values for the narrow concept property, and if you just keep the current vertical display, that results in a very long form, lots of vertical scrolling, and here it's laid out nicely, so better use of the real estate. Now let me show you the tables. So here's an example of a table where the value of this support business activity, instead of like showing two values, accounting and auto creation, we are actually showing here a little table that provides additional information about those values. The fact that accounting is performed by bookkeeper, for example, and auto creation is performed by sales assistant, whatever you decide to show on in this table, whatever additional details about those two activities you decide to show in the table. And the way this is accomplished, again, in an ontology is as follows. So there is this dash viewer property that you would select to be a table viewer. And then if you use a table viewer, you also have to specify the node constraint. And that property shapes that defines supports business activity already has a class constraint. So values of this property have to be business activity. In principle, you could use that same class as a value of a sh node constraint, but in reality, you probably wouldn't want to do that, because then you'll have as a column of that table every possible property of business activity. And typically for a table, you would want to pick a subset of columns. And this is why here we're using a separate node shape called business activity table view. And this node shape just only has three properties defined: a label, which we're calling activity name, then this activity of, and performed by, and that's the only thing that shows in a table. So again, quite often users want to show more information about the value of the relationship without having click through to see those additional details, and this display lets you do that. Now on to the general user interface improvements. We have improved the search panel in the situations where a number of search results is greater than the default maximum. By default, what is shown is up to 1,000 of results. And that could be configured, but still it would be some kind of a maximum. And in 7.0 in previous releases, if the number of results exceeds maximum, you just get a visual indication saying that it exceeds maximum, and Edge will only show up to the maximum. But you don't really know how many results are returned. So now there is an option for you to see a number of results that that exist. So let's say your maximum may be 1,000, but the number of results is 1,500. This way you know how many you are not being shown. We will also now show the user's full name if available, and you know, when you define a user account, you could provide additional information such as avatar, a name, phone number, other contact information that you may want to add for the user. So if the user's name is available, we'll show it in the user interface as opposed to the user ID. And that's where your login shows up, but it's also where governance roles for different assets are showing up. You'll see the full username instead of ID. There's a number of additional options in the source code panel where you now have a right click and click through menus, and similarly in change history panel. So let me just quickly show what I'm talking about. So I'm going to switch here, and you see the source code panel. And now you could, for example, mouse over, right click, and you know, you get this right click panel with various menu options. And you could also, you know, click through directly in the source code panel. And change history panel also has a number of new options like this. So switching back to my presentation. So, yeah, I've shown the navigation with a single click. Now, moving on to improvements specific to ontology development, we've added user interface for creating qualified cardinality constraints. And those of you who wonder what are qualified cardinality constraints, they are used when you're using the same property with different type of values. So for example, you have a property, team member, and you're specifying members of a project team, and you know that one of the project team member needs to come from a class of project managers, and maybe at least two needs to come from a class of software developers, and maybe you need at least one tester, etc. So you have different constraints on the cardinalities or quality or counts depending on the type of values. And previously to 7.1, you needed to use source code and actually type this constraint in RDF. And in 7.1, there is now a user interface for entering this type of constraints. We've also improved an algorithm for deriving property shapes from instances. In TopBraid EDG, you could enter property values, or you could have Edge figure out available properties for a class from a number of sources, like for example from a spreadsheet or from just RDF dataset. So in case of RDF dataset, it will profile data and it will say, okay, you've got the data about the person, and these are the kind of properties that we are seeing for a person. So let's create the model support for those properties. So this algorithm have been improved in order to understand classes, subclasses, etc., and provide a more comprehensive model from the instance data that you may make available to Edge. A small improvement is to RDF-AL properties panel, where you could now filter it to see only object properties, only data type properties. This is for those of our users who still use RDFS or OWL to define properties as opposed to using only shackle. The last improvement is specific to taxonomies. You could now not only say that the value of a property is a member of a certain class, but you could alternatively say that the value must come from a certain concept scheme. And that's useful when in your taxonomies you decide just to use SCAS concept as opposed to different subclasses of SCAS concept. Yet you want to say that the values for this, let's say, come from the geography concept scheme, or they come from food concept scheme, etc., without having to define subclasses of SCAS concept specific to support those taxonomies. So that's an alternative that some of the taxonomy developers find useful. Which brings me to some of the taxonomy development improvements. So the one that I just described is, of course, connected to that, but we also added capability to create a specific declared class for the top concept. So if it's defined that the top concept belongs to a certain class as opposed to just SCAS concept, then that would be used by default when you define top concepts of a concept scheme. And we also given you more flexibility on how create new concept dialog looks like. Prior to 7.1, a definition field was always hard-coded in this dialog, and some of our users found that it uses too much real estate. They don't really supply definitions in that initial create dialog. They provide it later on. So now it works the same as all the other fields. It doesn't show there by default. If you want it to be shown by default, then you will make it required by setting the min count to 1, and then it will show up in the create new dialog, just like any field that has min count 1, in other words, required. Any of those fields will show up in the create new dialog, and to give you an opportunity to enter the required fields as you create a new resource. All right, so with this, let me now quickly talk about some changes to Edge ontologies. This is primarily impacting users of the Edge metadata management package, or it mostly impacting them. Now, what we've had prior to 7.1 is pretty comprehensive governance model that included many different types of assets that were defined in typically enterprise asset collections or technical asset collections. And that made it difficult to use the governance, or not as convenient to use governance model for the users who have vocabulary management package or reference data management package, because they had no place to put those additional asset types. So the governance model was cut down to be more standalone, so it's easier to be used by users of any package. Everything that the governance model talks about is now self-contained within the governance model. That, we pared it down somewhat. Those additional relationships, for example, a relationship to various documents, relationships to various policies that are outside of governance model, still exist, but they have been moved to the ontologies that support, let's say, enterprise asset collections. So our Edge MM users could still use them in the appropriate types of the asset collection. So that's one type of changes. And then another type of changes, we made a number of adjustments to various asset types to improve the models. That part only impacts Edge customers. I mean, this part impacts all customers, but in a good way, in a positive way. So one example of the changes that we've made is, let's say, on the status. In 7.0, there is a separate status field, and then there is like status effective start date and effective end date as separate properties from the status. Now with 7.1, they become, as you could see, like reifications on the asset status. A similar change was made to the policy compliance. So now it's hanging on the policy itself. So it's like something is compliant with a policy, and then there is a dependent field that indicates approve or assurance of policy compliance. Because this is really related to a particular policy, it will be hanging on a policy. So there's improvements of this nature. And for 7.1, we will be providing detailed documentation on those model changes, as well as some utilities that you could run to see if those changes have impact on the data that you already assembled, and also to help you do the adjustments necessary for the migration if these changes impact you. We hope that the impact will be actually quite minor, and all the changes are, you know, improving the models and will be appreciated. Which leads me to another thing that I want to mention. For 7.1, we're doing significant improvements, making significant improvements to documentation. This is not yet ready for the beta, but this will be something that will be available for the release, and I think all our users will be quite pleased by the new documentation that we are putting together, with better search capabilities, better organization, and going forward, more context-sensitive help as well. So that's what I wanted to cover, and I will now switch to Jesse, who will talk about the Sharepoint term store integration. And Jesse had some issues joining directly with GoToWebinar, so he's going to be coming through my computer via via Slack share.
Yep. All
Okay.
right. Thanks, Irene, for slacking me in to be able to present. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And as Irene said, I'm going to demo the Sharepoint term store integration capability, which is one of the stepping stones to having eventual full cycle document auto classification, taxonomy management capabilities all integrated against your different SharePoints. What we decided to start with was with the term store, where we can push and pull taxonomy type structures in and out of SharePoint. So if you're seeing my screen right now, what I'm presenting is the SharePoint Admin Center, and I'm focused on the term store. And really what this is a structure of hierarchical terms. And for the demo today, I'm looking to get locations from TopBraid Edge, and I want to pull my topics into TopBraid Edge. So I've got this empty container or term set for locations, and I've got topics already populated, where even things like RDF here, if I show the advanced tags, you see a custom property from SharePoint saying standards body W3C. So this is just a key value pair. It's the way to basically give some context to the terms that are inside of SharePoint. So I want to pull this data into Edge, and then I also want to work with it, use Edge version control capabilities, curation and collaboration capabilities, work up a taxonomy, and then push something like locations back into Edge as well, plus any other changes to topics that we would want to make. But we're going to keep it simple. We're going to pull topics and we're going to push locations. So I'm going to switch back over to my TopBraid Edge, where I'm looking at this example webinar taxonomy. And here you can see locations is empty, and I don't have any type of topics. So here's where you're finally going to see some new stuff underneath the imports tab. The place to start is with import from Sharepoint term store. So as soon as I engage on this, Edge is actually going to use the API connection to Sharepoint dynamically, find out what term store is there, what term groups are there, and then inside of those term groups, what are called term sets, which is what we're finally going to want to actually pull in and treat as a structure to maintain as a taxonomy and govern here in TopBraid Edge. So I'm going to select topics, click continue. Edge will do its thing against the API, pull that content in. And always remember, we're demoing very quickly here, so I'm not using controlled workflows and that sort of thing. So really, you might want to be inside of a controlled workflow, do your connector, pull in, review it, get approval, commit to production. But here, I'm just operating directly as an admin, and I should have topics now available to me. And expanding down and clicking on RDF, you'll see what we've done is we've actually captured a RDF, a key value RDF representation of those custom properties. So they're here now for us to work with and do some post-processing, convert into more direct RDF representations. All kinds of things could be done against this now that we have it captured here in Edge. And then we can always make sure that we're serializing it, putting it back into Sharepoint if there was any type of enrichment that you wanted to have done. So we've imported, and I'll talk about the GUID, this ID here. Everything's going to have its own unique ID, and that's very much so. If there's anyone experienced with Microsoft in the audience, there's GUIDs for everything when you're dealing with Microsoft. So we'll talk about that actually here in a second, because it's important when we start looking at something like, what if I've already got a taxonomy, maybe in SCOS, maybe as a collection here in Edge, and up here I actually have my own independent scheme, not coming from Sharepoint down here, but up here I have Australia and Maine and other locations. And over on the right-hand side, notice there's no ID or GUID. These are things that I've created here in Edge, and I'm just going to say, well, I want Sharepoint to have these now. So let's go ahead and drag Maine down the locations, and let's grab Australia and drag that down and say, those are the two locations we want to make sure that we're pushing back in or into for the first time into Sharepoint. So this is where Exports tab has a new function for us, and that is to export to Sharepoint term store. So under the Imports tab, we've got the pull. Under Exports, we've got the push, and as well as everything else in TopBraid Edge, these are all web services, so this thing could be completely streamlined. So you could be having terms and tags being centralized in the TopBraid Edge programmatically in an automated way, getting pushed through approval processes and reviews, and then even automatically synchronizing and exporting to Sharepoint because it's all web service enabled. But here I'm going to just engage it myself directly, and we're going to push into Sharepoint. And if I go back over to Sharepoint and refresh my screen, I should be able to go down underneath locations and now find something like Australia and Maine being in here. So I've gone full circle. We could have manually created those. We could have loaded those terms from spreadsheets or whatever it was, building up your taxonomy and doing your curation and management in a more flexible, dynamic platform that is designed for vocabulary management inside of TopBraid Edge, versus having to work with this very rigid structure over here in Sharepoint, but being able to complement it and get those terms and concepts back into Sharepoint so that they could be used throughout that platform. And then next year when our Corpora connector comes, they would both be able to work in sync against Sharepoint, being able to pull terms or manage terms, being able to pull and represent the metadata of documents, run auto classifier on the TopBraid Edge system, and have that enriched search capability against all of the documents based on terms that Sharepoint itself could be indexing as well. So that's what we're shooting for, is that full life cycle capability of document and auto classification based on taxonomies in SharePoint. But just to finish, to make that point clear about the GUIDs, what's really cool, if we come back to TopBraid EDG now and go look at those taxonomy terms, those two that we pushed in, that wasn't just an export, that was a handshake, which was really important because we got back the IDs. So when we synchronized to push a taxonomy concept from TopBraid EDG into SharePoint for the first time, the handshake happened and we identified the need to get a GUID and bring that back. So these things are both kind of having the same pulse now, and we could push and pull changes from either side back and forth between the two of them. So with that, I believe we're back to you, Irene.
Actually, back to Holger. Holger, why don't you take over as a presenter and do your part of the presentation?
Yes. So I think I need to be. Yes, I'm organizer myself. Okay. Okay. So the main thing I would like to talk about is the new product called TopBraid EDG Studio. And one of the main roles of that product is to enable people to create extensions and customizations of TopBraid EDG, similar to how people have been using TopBraid Composer in the past. So on the slide that you see here, I've listed a few of the extension points and the places where TopBraid can be customized. And that includes things like being able to customize what goes on forms, what goes into the generated GraphQL APIs, user interface customizations, for example, to create new actions for the Explore menu or the Modify menu. Many other things are possible to be extended. So this is just one of the, or a subset of those extension points. And until now, up to version 7.0, people have been mostly doing those extensions by launching TopBraid Composer. Until 7.0, TopBraid Composer was bundling TopBraid EDG as a private, local, testable version. And you were able to just launch EDG from Composer through a menu in TBC. So then you would be able to do your changes, your customizations, like in this case here, some SWP, for example, in TBC, and then you would test them on the locally run Jetty server. And then when you would be happy with your changes and you have tried out your customizations, you would deploy them to a remote server, such as the company-wide production server. Until 7.0, many of those customizations relied on SWP and Spin in particular. And with 7.1 onwards, we went back to the drawing board and redesigned this whole process and basically eliminated TopBraid Composer from the picture for those people who want to do customizations and extensions, or for people who just want to locally evaluate TopBraid EDG. So in the new process, we have this product called EDG Studio that is also a locally downloaded application. And it's basically only starting the TopBraid EDG server locally. So that's all it does really. And once you have installed that, you're basically doing all your development and testing in the same environment. So you would be using TopBraid Studio to start the server, and then on the server you would be doing your customizations here, SWP scripts, for example, and then you would test them locally and then deploy them to the remote server when you're done. So no TBC needed anymore. We have made considerable improvements to the editing capabilities to enable this. So that basically all the features that people would commonly use for customization development are now available in Edge in the web user interface itself. Instead of focusing on SWP and spin, most of the customizations are now actually only requiring Shackle and JavaScript skills through the ADS, Active Data Shape framework. I'm going to talk about this in a second as well. So let's just look at the product. So when you download the TopBraid Edge Studio, you basically get a bunch of batch files for your platform. So for Windows or for Mac and Linux, you would launch it from a batch file. All you need to do first is to install Java 11. And once you have done that, you basically double click and you launch the server. So this is now locally running. So now I have, this is the start page of TopBraid Edge run locally from my own machine. So I have full control. I can do whatever I like. It's all saving to my own hard drive. There's no other server involved here for any of this. And so this is from Studio now. It's a fully functional TopBraid Edge version as well. So it has basically all the features available. So for example, I can go into taxonomy and do all the usual things that people would also do on Edge. Do editing and visualizations, whatever. Everything is there. The main difference, though, is that you also get the ability to edit files directly. And that is, of course, very important when you're working against your customizations, which are typically stored in files or ontologies. So when I go to the Files tab, I'm seeing basically my workspace on my local disk, and you can now use that to browse into the folders and actually, even if you want to even look into the files that are coming with TopBraid, so basically the system ontologies, you can theoretically even change them if you like. Let me just demonstrate how editing works with a simple example, and I'll create a simple SWP customization in this case. So let's say we want to add something to the Manage tab. Manage tab example. And I'm creating an SWP file, which is a turtle file, which has a specific name. So I'm creating this. It has created the file, and now I can go to edit that file. So clicking on edit will now use the file content, copy it into the database of TopBraid Edge so that it becomes available just like any other TopBraid Edge asset collection. And here I can now make the changes. So first, let me add an import here to make sure I can make changes to the tabs that I want to make, to the Manage tab. For this, all I need to do is import the Teamwork UI file, which is here. Now going back to my editor, I can go to Teamwork, Manage Plugins, and yeah, it's basically the full editing capabilities. It's a full ontology editor, if you like, that I have available here. In this editor, I can now create a new hello. Let's make just a hello world. Hello world manage plugin. And once I do that, I can now let's fill in some text so that we can see something on the screen. Let's make it a div. Whoops, that was a bit much. Div, and in the div we just print hello world, just to show something on the screen. And let's also make sure that the new plugin that we have created will show up for every user for every asset collection. So I've done that now. So I've saved the changes. So now I have this new customization. So now it will not yet show up, because currently I'm just editing this on my local hard drive or on the database, but it's not yet in as a file in the workspace. So the file itself has not yet been saved back. So, and to understand how this works, we can go back to the file in the workspace. So I've made changes to the file. You can see it has a star. It is shown in blue, and I can also show which changes have happened to that file. Here I've added a bunch of, the system has added a bunch of prefixes. So here you basically see a diff. So this was the old version that is on the disk, and that is these are the changes I've just made. And when you're happy with those changes, you can press the save button, and now basically the file will be overwritten, and now all the changes that I've made will be applied. So the file now, because I've added it and some SWP, and I've created a new file, I just refreshed the workspace, and now it should be there hopefully. If I now go to some asset collection like the geography example, I should now see my hello world example somewhere. It's showing up down here. So it's now a customization that I've plugged into TopBraid Edge. And I now have that file that defines the customization, and I can then basically publish that file to the remote server wherever this goes into production. And we have, for this, to make this easier than in the past, we have added a new Git integration that allows you to directly basically commit your changes to a Git repository. So if you're working against the same Git repository that the server does, you would push your changes to Git, and then on the server, someone would press a button or an automated script would run to pull the latest version down, and then also have these customizations. And if you don't want to use Git, you can still use project upload like in the past. All right, that was the main thing I wanted to show about TopBraid Studio. Now, briefly, two other topics that I wanted to mention. One of them is the so-called Query Booster. You can find the Query Booster as a new feature on the advanced server configuration pages. If you you need to be an administrator to enable this, and it's marked experimental and is switched off by default in 7.1 because it's a very, very low level change that we made, and we wanted to get a bit more familiar with usability, or with how people use it in practice and how well it works in practice. So basically what it does, every query, may it be Sparkle or GraphQL or whatever you have in the user interface, will be faster. About, in our measurements, it was 7 to 10 times faster. We do that basically when you activate this Query Booster and you have a big asset collection with lots of subgraphs. What it does, it will simply skip over certain subgraphs that it knows that it doesn't have to look into. So it uses an additional index for that. And that means when you query, for example, for the labels of something, it knows already in advance in which subgraph that the labels will be, so it will skip all the other subgraphs. And that will make things much quicker, hopefully. So please try it out if you have the capabilities, especially in Studio when you're just running locally. Please try it out and give us feedback on this. Another major area of work where we have done significant changes is our JavaScript integration. That was already available in 7.0, but we have put significant work into this technology called active data shapes. The architecture has been generalized so that now JavaScript is not just used for customizations within TopBraid Edge, so for example, for creating explore actions and so on, but you can also use it from other platforms. So in particular, you can now use the same API from web browser applications. So for example, when you're writing your code in React, you can use the same API that ADS, Active Data Shapes, is exposing And you can also use it from Node.js applications. So from when you're writing standalone JavaScript applications against the Node.js platform, you can now use the whole ADS API to basically talk to TopBraid EDG quite seamlessly. And I just have a very small example, and that gets very geeky for those who are not JavaScript people. But that's basically what you can now do. You can use your IDE of choice, like VS Code here in this case. You can write TypeScript files. You can just point the TypeScript to the API that we have published. And that includes your own classes that have been generated from ADS. You get all the goodies of that API, and then you can just run it from your debugger in Node.js. Everything should just work as similar to how you would run it locally, but it runs now from Node.js. So that's all I wanted to show. Back to Irene.
Thank you, Holger. And let me just finish it with a couple of slides and take questions. Actually one slide, just to mention that we have a few deprecated features. So for example, the class diagram, neighborgram panels, and relationship tree view have been deprecated because actually the edge diagram, the new edge diagram, subsumes all those capabilities. And there are a few other things that have been deprecated as shown here. And you could see this information also in the release notes. So just a handful of things that has been changed. With that, let's move to questions and over to Christy. I think she has a list of questions. I've already answered a couple of questions in chat, but I think we have more.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and submit your questions in the question box located on the right-hand side control panel. But we'll go ahead and we have a couple minutes left and see what we can address. I think this first one may be for Holger. Are you saying the entire ecosystem of Node.js is now available to Edge?
Yes, that's true. So basically what you can do, you can take any Node.js API that you would want to use. Like I'm sure there's even a Node.js API for Sharepoint integration if you need another one, or to talk to any external system. And what we offer is basically ADS, the ADS API as your interface to TopBraid with all the additional features that you need to talk to the RDF and make changes to the queries and so on. Otherwise, you can do whatever you like in your standalone Node.js applications.
Great. Thank you, Holger. Irene, maybe you can take this next one. Can I use the diagramming for editing, or is that planned?
Not in 7.1, but it's definitely planned for the subsequent releases. So we have big plans for this new feature, you know, ability to actually create information using it.
Great. Holger, what features of TBC are missing from Edge Studio?
So yeah, we've tried to make Edge Studio as complete as possible so that people are not missing TBC. And so all the features that used to be only in TBC, like spin editing, SWP editing, are now also available in Edge. So I hope that at least for all the customization work and all the work that people typically do, Edge Studio will be completely sufficient. And also keep in mind that Edge itself is a much more modern tool in a sense that it, for example, it has much better support for Shackle, which we never did in TBC. So I would say there is not much missing really, except for some esoteric features people got used to. Of course, it's a change for everyone. It's not 100% the same. It will never be, but it has, I would say it has more advantages than issues when you're migrating away from TBC.
Great, and I think we can fit in one more question for you, Holger. Will existing customizations continue to work in 7.1?
Yes. So we have not deactivated anything, at least nothing significant. And if there are changes, they have been recorded in the migration notes. But really, all the SWP, all the spin features that you have used in the past should still work. But we have shifted away a little bit and are now focusing more and more on JavaScript, also for the extensions. So we have added a number of extension points based on ADS.
Okay, great, thank you, Holger. And I think we're pretty much out of time. So thank you to Irene, Holger, and Jesse for a great webinar. We will be collecting the questions that we did receive today and did not provide answers to because we ran out of time in the form of probably a blog post that we'll be sending to all attendees. We'll also provide a link to the recorded presentation as well as to the slides. So thank you everyone for your attention today, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.